Hi, welcome to the new episode of Startups Rights. Today, my guest is Dr. Scott Smitson. Dr. Smitson is professor of practice and grand strategy at Denison University. He is a former U.S. Army strategist who is over 2 decades of service, an expert in geopolitics, defense, and national security policy. Dr. Smitson's work bridges theory and practice from the Pentagon to the classroom, exploring how nations craft strategy in the age defined by shifting global power. He's written extensively on grey zone conflict, compound security dilemmas, and evolving nature of deterrence. In this conversation, we'll dive into how AI, technology, and geopolitics are reshaping the global order. Welcome, Dr.
Thank you, Javed, for that kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to join your podcast. It's been great to see how much you've done professionally since our time together at Amherst College, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have this delightful conversation with you and your listeners.
So this is very exciting, and it's very significant for me because, I was your student, and taking your class was definitely one of the highlights of my college career. Just really enjoyed our discussions, the lessons I learned, and the way you just conducted classes. Even if there were 3 hours, I don't think anybody was bored there. That's for sure. So I'm really excited that we now essentially going to have a similar conversation, but we're going to televise it with a wider audience. So thank you so much for that. I guess it's only fitting that I start my questions by tying it back to one of the classes you've taught, which is called grand strategy at Amherst College. The way I understood it at the time, grand strategy meant connecting nations means to its desired ends. So in today's fragmented, digitally accelerated world, what does grand strategy even mean anymore?
So thanks. This is a great question and a great, I think, kickoff discussion for what we hope to kind of cover today. Before I kind of answer your question, I'll do that professorial thing and maybe throw out when I hear grand strategy, what it means. You did a really good job of kind of articulating this idea of how nations use resources of varying types to pursue their national interests, right? And so we can think about grand strategy as the study, the discipline, the approach by which nations use economics, diplomacy, military power, tech, ethics, soft power, all those things orchestrated together to pursue their interests in both times of peace and in times of war. And most frequently, if we look at the broader interests of a grand strategic approach, they usually center around three things: prosperity, stability, and some level of security. Where we see variation over time, dependent upon if we're talking about one nation or a series of nations, is how do nations do that? How do they kind of pursue those things going forward? And so I think even with the shifting technological landscape, and I think that we'll kind of delve into this a lot, I think that countries still do practice some level of strategy, whether or not they're kind of at this grand level that maybe we can look back and say, we can really see what the United States and the West grand strategy was throughout the Cold War, or what was the grand strategy of the British Empire against the French in the 1700s. I don't know if we're there right now, and we can get into some aspects of that. But countries are always trying to further themselves. They're always trying to go from the present to hopefully a more prosperous and stable future. Now, how they get there is what's of interest, right? And then are these things that use military power, economic statecraft, the things that we're going to talk about, but also how the government influences the private sector. What does the government do from a market perspective? And I think one of the things that hopefully we'll get a chance to unpack today is how I think that the role of the state is actually increasing, not decreasing, particularly if we look at the information revolution and how governments are trying to do more and more to control economics in ways that give them favorable advantages. So in other words, the days of laissez-faire economics, even in places that we would expect it to be playing out, like in the West and especially in the United States, we may not be there right now. Geopolitics may be informing that, but geoeconomics, the pursuit of a nation's economic interests as informed by geography, is really, really coming to the fore. And I think this is something that we've only kind of turned the leaf on in the last year or so. So grand strategy and ecological discipline, it's how you see the forest through the trees. It's about taking and looking at all different variables by which an organization, a state, even non-state actors have strategies, right? Strategy is a plan, is a theory of success at the end of the day. And so while we're seeing that strategy kind of play out in real time, the way in which countries are pursuing it particularly the United States, is different right now. Our broad question, I think we'll kind of get to this later, is this a blip on the radar, or is this transaction-based, nation first, rest of the global community later approach, this kind of neo-mercantilism, is this the new, and how does that play off in the strategies that the Russias, the Chinese, the Americans, the Turks, you name any country, the French, the British, the Canadians, how are they kind of navigating this?
You kind of touched upon it, but I want you to elaborate a bit further, because I feel like looking back at the 20th century, you could definitely see this ideological divide, and you felt like all the technological development and advancement, even the space race, meant to serve this ideological purpose. But I feel like there's been a bit of a shift, and technology has taken a more predominant role in many ways. In your opinion, how much of today's geopolitics is driven by ideology, and how much of it is by technology only?
So this is a good question, and I'll start with a quick anecdote, and then I'll shift to answering your main question. So interestingly enough, in the time leading up to World War II, when the West, you had the challenge of rising Germany, of rising Imperial Japan, rising fascist Italy, kind of all of these countries were kind of questioning and challenging the existing, not only balance of power, but the existing kind of status quo of what the international economic system looked like. And so things like tariffs and protectionist measures began in the 90s, the previous time of isolationism and America wanting to be great again, actually drove and compelled aggressive military and economic behavior from these states that were challenging the status quo. At the same time that was happening, there was a movement, very, very quiet, but there was a movement of technological utopians that were both in the United States and in Canada. Elon Musk's grandfather was one of these individuals that envisioned something called the Technate of America, which was a US-based supercontinent across, going literally from Greenland all the way to northern Venezuela. Tell me if this sounds familiar, where a government would be based more on technology and on purely private sector interests than on politicians and policy subject matter experts. So in other words, the free market in and of itself, informed by scientific rigor, could overcome perceived weaknesses in political institutions. And I just bring this up because that in and of itself is an ideal that sees technology not necessarily as an end, but a means towards something greater, a different kind of idealized form of the nation state, or a macro state, if you will. To your point about the space race, and I think we could talk to this about a lot of other technologies, one of the things that it sounds like you and I are on the same page, that we always have to caution what I call technological triumphalists, is you cannot divorce the ideological context in which technology comes about, right? And these two things are not mutually exclusive. Let's say, look at the previous Biden administration's take on renewables and green tech. There was a lot of money and a lot of economic incentives and a lot of government funds that went to help excite and catalyze, research and development on green tech. That's all ended because of who has won the recent elections, right? Europeans are having the same type of question right now, and it's less, I would say, a shift of political orientation, but the hard, stark realities of critical minerals, value chains, and the fact that nations need energy. There are no rich nations that are energy poor, right? Economic wealth is a function of energy access and energy distribution and affordability. So you have that. I think one of the things that we're seeing, maybe if we can tie this a little bit into kind of the AI race right now, is it seems to be that many believe that the race to kind of assume the commanding heights of AI and the technical and the microchip, the silicon aspect of that, this is the new great game of the 20th. So if the 19th century kind of driving imperative was to secure a coal and have access to coal locations, and coal literally was the engine that drove the Industrial Revolution and power projection going forward. And if the 20th century it was oil, is the 21st century going to be one based on silicon and digits and ones and zeros? So we can get into that. But I think what's interesting is it seems as if both East and West believe that this is the dominant race, right? It's one of the reasons why you see China doing what it's doing in the tech race. It's one of the reasons why You're seeing significant state intervention. So in other words, what we kind of see in Beijing, we're seeing more and more in the United States, right? The US government now has a 10% controlling stock in Intel. It was not a coincidence that the heads of all the major tech firms were sitting in the first row at Donald Trump's inauguration back in January. And so there seems to be this thinking that whoever gets to the top and stays there is going to influence and really assume the commanding heights of the magnitude and direction of the international system going forward. And what I think is fascinating is you're kind of seeing a clash of kind of maybe two different ways to do that. There's the one that your listeners are very, very familiar with, and many of us who either grew up or were educated in the West, one that relies heavily on venture capital, one that is based on entrepreneurial spirits, one that kind of champions this idea of failing fast, right? The other kind of model, the one that some say may eventually catch up, and maybe we can argue whether or not that will happen, is one where it's not market driven, but it's state driven. One that there you are risk averse, and that rather than failing fast, there can be zero defect. So those two approaches create different incentive structures and different risk taking at the end of the day. And I think that this is something that I think is going to be really important for us to kind of pay attention to. I think the other aspect of this is the fact that sometimes if we look at innovation over time, and we look at advances in technology, particularly as it relates to things that are very, foundational to the human condition, let's say war. Many times technology outpaces doctrine and applicability in policy, right? So when the atomic bomb was created, the United States with the British were able to create a new weapon. But then the question is, well, what do you do with it, right? So international relations had to create a whole body of research, not done by military people, but by international relations scholars like Thomas Schelling, to think about, okay, well, how do you build a strategy around something that you hope you never have to use, right? And there's countless examples of where an emergent tech comes along and people don't know quite how to use it, right? So if we think back to World War II, a lot of the major weapons platforms that any of us would be familiar with, the aircraft carrier, the airplane, the tank, the submarine, these all existed in the First World War, but the technology was more advanced than the application, doctrine and the theory of how we use these things. And so I think as we kind of look at the AI race and we try to kind of pay attention to where these things are going, in many ways, the technology is, again, outpacing international norms. It's challenging the way that people think about these things. And so I think this is something that's going to be very important for us to watch. How you answer that question is a function of political ideology. Is technology something that should be used as a tool for prosperity, right? So the same technological capability that someone could use to go on a date with someone tonight, order a pizza, order tennis shoes online, book a vacation, that same technology can also be used to measure the desired social capabilities of someone in an oppressive state, where that technology can be used in a surveillance capacity to monitor the private acts of citizens. So, and that's all about ideology. The technology is just a means towards greater ideological end.
This focus on technology and technologists playing such a dominant role in policymaking and dictating the future of geopolitics. Do you think that was kind of a natural progression that was going to happen now in this era, or do you think AI suddenly just accelerated in that direction?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I defer to the experts on some of the high-end capabilities of AI, difference between AI, generalized AI, things of that nature. But I think it's a combination of, it's a technology that's been improved over time, but what it's done is, as the technical capability of it has taken off, it's changed the way people think about its utility and its application, right? So that's why, I think just this week, The Economist had an article about, is AI coming for your white collar job or not? And so, it's one of these things. Interestingly enough, we're kind of looking at a lot of the similar debates that we had in the rise of the fourth industrial revolution with robotics. Were things going to make jobs obsolete? And the same was the debate at the time of the industrial revolution. And kind of what we found, it wasn't that machines overtook people's ability to be employed. It created new professional sectors. And some of those, I don't know if we've completely anticipated yet. No, I think one of the things we may get to later on is while there is a huge amount of tension of what things like NVIDIA's AI or other tech firms' AI can do for you, there's a hard geographic and physical reality of this technology. So to me, it's as much a race of who can have the most highly capable generative AI model with the right type of microchip as it is who has access to the resources to build these things. Where does power come to sustain them, right? I live in a part of the United States which has the third highest concentration of data centers in the US. So the US has half of the world's data centers right now, and the half of those data centers that it have tends to be concentrated in different areas. They're not uniformly distributed. So while the building of these data centers and a lot of the tech hubs around them promise employment, right, economic and urban growth, there's also the challenge of, okay, well, I have to build this infrastructure. Well, where does that come from, right? Who's going to be able to access those things? If on one side you believe, as I believe the White House does, that America's economy can be resilient to the self-induced shocks of tariffs and economic statecraft, that's all worth doing to deal with to win the race for AI, right? But what happens if it doesn't? Or what if the promise of AI doesn't quite deliver in ways that many of us think? We just don't know.
Mm.
But it's, again, I think it's kind of illustrative of the fact that we're in slightly uncharted territory.
Mm.
There are some who worry that there may potentially be an AI bubble, or there could be an AI infrastructure bubble. Many of us have seen kind of the graphics of energy demand now, energy demand in a 2030 AI future, what the grid can support and where the grid would need to go. So these are all big questions, but it's very, very clear that this is motivating. And I've talked a lot about the United States and China, but you're seeing other countries, UAE, UK, just to name a few, that are also seeing opportunities within this new race.
Yes. You're very much right. And also, nobody can really claim to be an expert because it's developing so fast. I think you can't really catch up with everything to claim to be an expert in this space. You mentioned something very interesting, and I want to ask a very quick follow-up question. You said even in the West, you're seeing more and more, obviously, we're seeing state intervention in the development of technology. But as you said, there are kind of conflicting natures, right? States are more reserved. They don't really like the facts. They don't like risks and failures, whereas entrepreneurial nature is just by the nature of it. It's all about failing and doing it again and again. How do you think that this contrasting, conflicting relationship evolving as we go forward?
Yeah, so this is a good question. I think there's maybe two different methods by which we can consider this. One, I think one of the reasons why you're seeing greater state intervention right now, and mostly in the West, you have significant, obviously, state intervention because state-owned enterprises in places like Egypt and in China are kind of the normal there. But I think that we have new definitions now of what are strategic goods. If we would have had a conversation in the late 1990s or the early 2000s of the internet or the information age, I don't know if we would have called that necessarily a strategic good in the way that we do even now, critical minerals, oil, different types of industrial capacities. But if the 21st century is going to be heavily influenced by kind of the digital revolution, then things that go into creating AI and their supporting software and their hardware programs, well, now that in and of itself is a strategic good. And we've seen historically, governments will frequently get involved in private sector entities if they view something as strategic, right? So we've seen that with energy. We've seen that with other materials. And now I think we're seeing it more and more in the tech and the AI space. Again, I go back to the image of the inauguration and Tim Cook and the head of Google and the head of NVIDIA and the head of Facebook sitting behind Melania at the inauguration. So government is having more and more of an interest in those things. So I think that's one aspect of it.
We are, in this AI race, obviously the dominant power is US, but also China is actively investing, is doing a lot in this space too. And I feel like we talk more about AI and compute and data more than we talk about conventional military power, right? In this day and age. And in a way, the new modern wars are changing the perspectives of how warfare is conducted too. Like against these massive tanks, and you can use chip drones, which is really shifting the warfare dynamic too. Do you think power in the 21st century is shifting from territory and military might to data, compute, and control over algorithms?
So this is a good question. So when I think about power, right, I like to kind of differentiate between force and power. So this is going to be a little bit of I am not a physicist, but so forgive any of your listeners who are. Forgive me for any of the listeners who are. But force is achieving movement, right? But mass times acceleration. But power is lasting, is that force lasting over time. And so I think while there's been kind of a predominant kind of belief in the use of utility of different types of military force, the question is what's lasting. That's how we kind of get into this question of, the West was heavily involved in Afghanistan in 20 years and fought a war against an adversary that had no airplanes, no aircraft carriers, no submarines, yet was able to be victorious, right? So there's questions about kind of the utility of the military instrument of power. I think, however, to tie it a little bit back to your question, is at the end of the day, the use of these things remains the purview of the state. There's increased reliance on non-state actors. But I also think one of the things that we kind of have to consider is what you may recall this from our discussions at Amherst, the difference between the enduring nature and the shifting character of war. And so what do I mean by that? And hopefully I can explain this in a way that resonates with your listeners. But if we think about war as as something that is kind of, elemental to kind of, human nature. And because of that, both from a physiological and a psychological perspective, the things that make states, make people fight each other is kind of ingrained in our psychology and in our anatomy, right? The famous Greek historian Thucydides said the main drivers of war are the pursuit of fear, honor, or interest, right? These are the things that motivate us. So if we see war as a nonlinear human phenomenon that's all about politics, that is tough in and of itself to forecast, that has a nature on its own, that's always going to be there. Now, how we see that competition manifest, the character of war does change over time, right? 25 years ago, the United States was the only country that had armed drones, right? And that was not started by the Department of Defense. That was started by the CIA to use to attack al-Qaeda targets. Fast forward to 2025, now armed drones are ubiquitous. The thing that I would say, though, is that even with the imagery and the videos that we get from both Ukraine and from Russia that shows drone strikes, drone operations, at the end of the day, the greatest casualty-causing weapon right now in the front line in Ukraine is artillery. It's cannons, right? So while new tech may come along, it doesn't always have this significant kind of disruptive effect of what we call a revolution in military affairs, where war looks a lot different than maybe it did in the past, right? And so this is a huge area of debate right now, not just within the security studies field, but within the tech field. Right? If unmanned systems are the future, companies like Anduril Technologies that are becoming highly, highly influential in a AUKUS Pillar 1, Pillar 2 world, then you have economic incentives to support those type of defense contracting firms, right? That's the new reality, that manned, unmanned systems that are kind of operated from different platforms, what have you, swarm tactics and technologies. This is where you're kind of at the cutting edge of thinking. But there's also the last piece that I'll say on this, Java, which is the fact that even if a country or a nation or even a non-state actor, let's say Hezbollah or FARC in Latin America, if they get a hold of an emergent technology, like many things, you don't have very long of a first mover advantage, right? Eventually, there will become a counter response to things. Immersive or emergent tech that can give you an advantage at the end of the day is not the most consequential thing at the operational level. At the end of the day, countries have to have a meaningful strategy. You can have a very, very effective military or an effective technical sector or public-private collaboration that does stuff at the low level. But if it's not oriented and driven towards a coherent strategy, it's not going to be effective. That's how you can win every battle in Vietnam and not win the war, right? That's where you can be Kodak and be the discoverer of digital photography, but choose not to invest in it because that's not the way we do things at Kodak. Now you're opposite, right? So there's that need to look beyond just the flashy new tech and understand its utility in a broader context, which is really, really important.
Well, Dr. Smitson, your knowledge of technology is quite well. The Kodak example was a very good one. Speaking of defense and speaking of weapons, obviously with every new technology, humans find a way to apply it to the weapons, to warfare. And AI is already transforming logistics, transforming surveillance, intelligence, and everything. Even I think I recently saw an article somewhere that the U.S. Army general uses ChatGPT to make more informed decisions.
Mm-hmm.
What aspects of war, defense, warfare, deterrence do you think will AI change fundamentally? Which aspects will remain, that is in your opinion, stubbornly?
Yeah, no, this is a good question. And I think we hit a few of these things recently. But I think right now we're kind of in, I don't want to say undiscovered territory, but both from an exercise, a doctrine, a simulation, but also in a real-time perspective, we're seeing different ways in which AI can be used, right? So, for example, early on in the war in Ukraine used open source intelligence information, data from people's cell phones, in a fairly useful AI model to predict and come up with ways of trying to understand where Russian aerial attacks would come from, right? That then drove prioritization and allowed them to understand, okay, well, which missiles are likely to hit key targets, which missiles are ones that we can let fly over, and how does that kind of go forward, right? You see this also with surveillance. One of the earliest things that the IDF used in the opening stages of the invasion of Gaza was using AI models of a predictive nature to try to establish patterns of life. They would try to differentiate, is someone a Hamas fighter, is someone an innocent Gazan, what would that look like? Now, there's a lot of ethical things that we can kind of unpack there. But I just use both of those of illustrative examples of how people are thinking about different applications of AI. To your point about, a general using AI, one of the things that's kind of debated in the part of community that I used to be in strategy and strategic planning is how much of strategy development should you rely on AI to do for yourself, and versus how much of that needs to have, a human fingerprint or a human decision maker in it, right? So over the last 20 years, if we've looked at the role of technology in defense and security affairs, we've shifted from this idea of having a human in the decision-making loop to having a human on the loop. Now there are some who are talking about a human near the loop. And when I talk about the loop, it's this find, fix, finish decision cycle, if you will, or the John Boyd OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act phenomenon. So I think that there's a lot of things that are out there. But like our previous conversation about both this Chinese and American and Western kind of cognition that the race for AI is the defining character of the 21st century, I think the military is trying to figure some of those things out right now. But at the end of the day, even with as much information as you can have, you're still talking about people who have to make decisions, right? Subject to mistakes, having to try to make informed decisions with incomplete information in dynamic environments. That's just not going to change. And last but certainly not least on this topic, I think the thing that our readers need to our listeners should always kind of bear in mind is that even these emergent domains of human or nation state competition and interaction, like cyber with AI, like space, there was a terrestrial geographic manifestation of those domains that we undercount, right? So for example, our ability, the ability of nation states to use space as a frontier for information, but also potentially warfare, is reliant on ground tracking satellites that are in a country that you can find easily that, are things that could be attacked or could be exploited. The same with, somebody may have a powerful information technology capability. At the end of the day, there's a server somewhere that's being fed by water somewhere to chill that cooling tower, that there are things that are targetable surfaces. And so it's important for us to just kind of realize that these things don't just kind of exist in the miasma of the cloud in and of itself has roots, right? And these are just things that we have to consider.
If I could draw parallels between this age and the nuclear age, where the concept of mutual deterrence really shaped decades of peace. I mean, yes, you had proxy wars and proxy warfare, but it did shape decades of peace. How does, or I guess, what does AI deterrence look like, in your opinion? Can we even control this continuous AI escalations, this pursuit of AGIs, as all nations are really, like America, China is pursuing? Can that even be controlled?
No, this is a good question. And then for our listeners, I think it's good when scholars or national security professionals talk about deterrence, we're talking about the threat of the use of force to compel someone to stop doing something that they're doing, right? So it's, hey, I have something that can impose costs on you. And if you don't stop doing it, I may use it, right? Or don't even think about doing something because I have this capability, right? So meaningful deterrence in and of itself usually has two components, right? Capability. So in other words, do you have something that can do what you say it can do, but also the political will, right? Do I believe that my adversary, my rival, are they being serious when they threaten, hey, I will do this if you do something. Here is my red line, or are you not? So this gets to this question of credible deterrence of both a general and a specific nature. You gave the example of mutually assured destruction as a component. It wasn't the only component of things that tried to bring about strategic stability in the Cold War. So there was obviously, we got to the point in the Cold War where both sides realized they could not only destroy each other, but had enough weaponry to destroy all of humanity. And besides just those technical means, you had to have things like treaties. You had to establish some type of communication red line from state to state. That there needed to be ramps to get off the escalatory ladder, if you will. And so all those things combined brought that type of strategic stability that you had in the Cold War. The challenge that we're having now is a lot of those things are coming off, right? There was just talk this week about ramping up nuclear weapons testing. Some of that may just be for theater. The last country to test the nuke was North Korea in 2017, we think. So you have that bluster that's out there, but it's not just the technology that existed. It was the fact that there were institutions and mechanisms to try to bring transparency, but also credibility to what each side had. And if I understand your question as it relates to AI you haven't heard the Trump administration talk about this much, but the Biden administration really tried to get ways to sit down with China to say, look, despite all of our differences and competitions, there is the potentiality that this technology has a way to get ahead of where we think it could go, right? And how do you kind of put limits on that? I think in this era that we're in right now, this is a great characteristic, which is major transnational issues like the race of the AI, climate change, human security. These are transnational challenges that require nations to work together. Yet we're in an era right now of extreme geopolitical competition. We're working together, even with your historical allies and partners, is not necessarily given, right? So to what that means to your question of how do you ensure that you have human decision making, even with AI there, when it comes to things like nuclear weapons or other critical technologies? I think it's a challenge, and in many ways, it goes back to the discussion that we had a few minutes ago about the role of political ideology and belief systems as it relates to the tech. Right? I heard a scholar say that when you think about the information domain and human decision making, there's really three levels, right? There's the hardware, there's the software, and then there's what he calls the wetware, which is what happens between the 6 inches between our ears. And it's only when you put those things together that we can kind of really comprehend the dynamic nature of these challenges.
We are seeing new alliances and kind of reshaping of these partnerships and all the alliances, new alliances like AUKUS, expanding BRICS. Are we drifting, in your opinion, towards this bipolar world again, where the dominant powers will be US and China, and then there's some proxy countries? Or do you think we are entering the stage of very messy multipolar one?
Yeah, so this is a good question. And you opened up with this question about things like AUKUS, the Quad, BRICS. These are all examples of what a lot of scholars are calling mini-lateralism. So while there may be questions or hesitancies by countries, to include the United States, of really embracing multinational institutions in the way in which we did in the past, there seems to be an approach right now whereby countries are kind of pursuing more short-term transactional relationships that are not necessarily binding. So the Quad is the US, Japan,
India.
Australia, and India. This was an idea from a previous Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe, who unfortunately was assassinated a few years ago. And it's through him and him alone that we even have the phrase the Indo-Pacific, right? Before the Quad came about, no one was kind of using the Indo-Pacific as a geographic reference point. You had the Indian Ocean basin, you had the Pacific. We know that these two regions are interrelated, but it took a mental construct, birthed in the context of geopolitics for us to kind of think about this. And so because of that, it's allowing countries, I think, to get involved in more short-term, and even if they have a big time horizon, but short-term non-binding agreements to kind of further their interests in a world that may be shifting in, its polarity. I do think one of the things that's important for us to kind of discuss is, if we're out of the quote unquote unipolar era, I don't necessarily means that that's a bad thing for the United States or a bad thing for the world. Historically, there's always been, at least in the modern period for the last 500 years or so, there's always been multiple poles, right? So we had a bipolar era after World War II. In the lead up before World War II, you had the rise of the Soviet Union. You had multiple European-based colonial empires. The United States, we go through these periods of global engagement and isolationism, and I think we're going through that again right now. So you kind of have that. I think to me, the broader question is, if you have competing centers of economic and political and diplomatic and informational power, does that make the whole construct more or less stable? So even before the last shot was fired in World War II, smart people gathered in places like Bretton Woods in New England and other places in the world to say, we've seen two instances in the last 25 years of world war. So in other words, the status quo is no longer sufficient. And so the United States led the creation of what was called the rules-based international order that embraced things like global trade, an emphasis on human rights, an agreement that countries should not use force to expand or change borders. So all these ideas, all that was kind of held up by the great kind of insurance broker that was the United States, right, throughout the Cold War era. And in that model, that grand strategy of containment, if you will, of Soviet expansionism allowed the West to kind of preserve and leverage its strengths while the Soviet Union started to fall behind, right? And so the Soviet Union had basically within it the seeds of its own destruction. The question then, when the Soviet Union went away, was what do the rest of the most powerful countries in the world do now? And so I think we're still asking that question 30 odd years after the Berlin Wall has come down, 3 decades after the end of the Soviet Union. And so it's impacting not only what countries do externally, but it impacts their domestic politics, right? So the rise of populism that we see in the West has to be about more than just who's on television right now, right? Is this a rejection of aspects of globalization that were under-delivered? Is it the fact that globalization did not necessarily lift all boats, right? To use kind of the economic phrase that a rising tide lifts all boats. And what does that look like going forward? And so if we have an America that is more unilateral and geomercantile in its global outlook, and we have a Russia that's doing what it's doing, a China that's doing what it's doing, countries like Turkey, countries like Israel, countries like Japan, India, they're trying to figure out what do they do going forward. I think there was an idea or a belief that after Russia invaded Ukraine, that you would have a clear kind of bifurcation of nations. The United States, the West, free market, capitalist, maritime-oriented countries on one side, and, the greater Eurasian autocratic kind of model on the other side. And we haven't really quite seen that yet. Right? Many countries don't want to they would say, we don't want to have to choose. We want to buy Russian oil because it's cheap, because we need it, but we want to be a security partner with the United States, right? Or, we want to maintain our alliance with the United States. Let's say if you're a country like the Philippines or South Korea, but China's literally
Trade with
right
China.
there. So how do you kind of manage these things going forward? And I think also within that, you have not just changes in countries' political orientation or hedging from a security perspective, but you're hedging economically. Even before Donald Trump 2.0 or Donald Trump 1.0, countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE realized that even if we are not even close to this idea of peak oil, at the end of the day, those countries' economies we're going to have to diversify. And so you're seeing that slowly but surely happening, right? You're finding ways to avoid an over-reliance on one aspect of your economy. It's one of the reasons why Abu Dhabi wants to become the major tech hub, in many ways is approaching that to be the net tech hub for the Middle East region. It's one of the reasons why just this week in the major meeting that's held in Riyadh every October called Davos in the Desert, unofficially, the discussion was critical minerals. Hey, it just so happens that in many of the very remote, underpopulated areas in the Arabian Peninsula, there's rare earth minerals there, and there's critical minerals as well. So what does all this mean going forward? So in a long-winded way to answer your question, I think there's a recognition that whatever the post-war in the post-Cold War era, whatever that stability was, is no longer there. Economic, strategic, biological shocks like COVID, this is the new normal. It's forcing countries and corporations, quite frankly, I believe, to focus less and less on efficiency and more on effectiveness, right? It's one of the reasons why business schools for 30 years didn't really teach a whole lot on geopolitics. If you wanted to do business in an emerging market in the global south, and you had enough money, you could do it, right? If I wanted to open up a textile operation in Hanoi, it was feasible, right? Well, now I have to think about, that's near the South China Sea. And if something goes down over Taiwan, my ability to get my product to market is going to be really hard if the U.S. Navy and the People's Liberation Army Navy is shooting at each other. Mm-hmm. So we have to think these things through until we get whatever the new paradigm of strategic stability is. The chaos is the new normal.
Professor, what happens to the smaller states? Like I am from one of them, right? Like Azerbaijan, there's a bunch of them in Eastern Europe and Middle East and in the Pacific. What is going to become of their role in this new great power competition? I'm guessing neutrality is not really possible anymore either. So what do you think about that?
No, it's a good question. And I do agree with you. It will be harder and harder for countries to say objectively neutral. And that's really even if they ever were at all, right? So let's give two classic European examples. Switzerland is always seen as this effectively neutral state in the heart of Europe, friends to everyone, enemy towards none. They're spending a tremendous amount of time and energy right now on societal resilience, right? Thinking about, do we need to build more bunkers in the event of a conflict? A country like the Republic of Ireland, which historically has seen, they're not a member of NATO, they're a member of the EU, has always thought about their military in a very small role. And if the Irish military has done anything in the last 30 years, they put a premium on peace operations, right? But it only took a few Russian submarines off the west coast of Sligo for the Irish to say, well, we sit on an important patch of land, right? The International Maritime Commons in the North Atlantic. And so things like fiber optic cables that are near our borders, and we're an island nation that has to import things. What are our new vulnerabilities? So small nations, I think, are making those strategic calculations. Countries like your home country, Azerbaijan, while small, are trying to find ways to, rather than become prisoners of their geography, take advantage of that geography in a meaningful way, right? So it's one of the reasons why the recent kind of agreement that President Trump kind of fashioned out between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and this idea of the Trump route for international peace and prosperity. The trip, we can debate whether or not it will actually happen or not. For the sake of argument that it does, if there's ways for Azerbaijan to get their energy to the Mediterranean that avoids routes to the north into the Black Sea and skirts Iran and keeps Turkey on side, Now Azerbaijan is extremely relevant. I mean, it's relevant now, but it's even more relevant, particularly if you're now at the doorstep of a Europe that's trying to diversify its energy sources. So the map can be a hindrance, right? It also can be an opportunity. And so this is why a country like Azerbaijan is able to navigate the fact that it's surrounded by, or not surrounded, but it's proximate to bigger countries, right? Iran, Turkey, Russia, the Russian sphere, if you will. But they're playing their cards as well as they can, and they can do that because of what's in their soil, right? What's other countries are trying to kind of figure out what this means going forward as well. And politics of countries are changing. Just last week, or about 2 weeks ago, Bolivia had an important presidential election, and the first time in 25 years, Bolivia has a center-right, pro-U.S., pro-free trade, pro-democracy, pro-capitalist government. This would have been crazy to even consider 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago when Evo Morales took over. In Argentina, a country that many people say has a tremendous amount of potential, but because of economic policy decisions by previous governments has been under-delivering. Well, the president of Argentina, Javier Milei, is doing a lot of things which people said, hey, if he does these austerity measures and he cuts government subsidies, he's not going to last. His party in lower level just did very, very well, right? So I think countries that are maybe not in a position to dictate terms to quote unquote the great powers can be consequential if they're willing to kind of look for opportunities going forward. And I think Azerbaijan is a great example of that.
Fair enough. Oil and energy will always be important. I mean, renewable energy didn't really deliver what it was supposed to deliver. So there's always going to be, at least for foreseeable futures, this reliance on oil and gas. I mean, even for AI data centers, we need energy, right? But equally, as you mentioned already quite a few times, we are entering an era where semiconductor supply chains are becoming extremely important. GPU supply, like it's becoming part of this wider geopolitics, who you can apply to chips, who you cannot supply to chips. And rare earth minerals, as you said, even in Abu Dhabi, you said there's this Davos in the desert, right? Like this conversation around rare earth minerals. So they're becoming as strategic as oil once was. What lessons and parallels we can draw and apply from past energy geopolitics to this new compute geopolitics?
This is a good question. I think there's a few features of some things that if we look at, let's say, the Industrial Revolution, the shift to oil in the early 90s, a lot of these things that kind of drove different directions of how energy were pursued really were based on policy decisions, right? So I think one of the things that's going to be important is that at the end of the day, no matter what kind of the market demands, governments are going to have a huge hand in kind of influencing how decisions are made on things, right? A classic example, right before World War I, Winston Churchill is the Lord of the Admiralty. The Royal Navy rules the waves globally, and that Navy is powered by coal. Early 90s, there's this discovery of significant oil deposits in the Middle East. Churchill makes the decision to shift the Royal Navy's reliance on coal to oil for a whole host of reasons, and it literally changes the direction of warfare, right? A lot of the militarily aggressive things that we saw happen in World War II were done by countries trying to get things they did not have, right? Imperial Japan invades what was then the Dutch East Indies, now what we know as Indonesia and Brunei, because there was oil there. Japan doesn't have oil, right? One of the reasons why the Nazis drove deep into the Soviet Union and towards the Caucasus was because oil. Again, we're back to Azerbaijan, right? Energy. So you have to have that energy as a driver for your economic engine. That economic engine then provides the basis of literally your ability to manage and project power in times of war. So I don't think any of that is going to change. So that's to say commerce may go in one way, but the flag will follow, right? Britain expanded and gained India as part of its empire, not because the Royal Navy went there first, but the British East India Trading Company went there, right? And then as a country starts to recognize, hey, we have economic advantages, we have to protect those advantages. And that protection of advantage is going to come in some type of military or security aspect of things. I think also, just like coal and oil, access to these things, rare earths, critical minerals, they're not uniformly distributed around the world. So parts of the world that maybe did not have a whole lot of geopolitical resonance in the past do right now, or we'll look at things slightly different. I think the other thing that's important for us to kind of realize is that even if AI delivers on many of the ways that we hope it does, and the energy grid in different parts of the world kind of catches up to that, all these changes, I like to think about these as additions, not necessarily transitions, right? So even though we think about coal as this kind of 19th century hydrocarbon, or oil as something that was from the 20th century, we're still using these things in mass quantities, right? Last year, China burned more coal than in any other country in history. Right? So one of the ways that they're powering their electrical revolution is through coal, right? It's not through green tech. The green tech that China creates, a lot of that is sold in other markets to keep their dual circulation economic model going. So it's just going to be important for us to kind of remember some of these features if and when we get to this kind of new economic landscape driven by AI.
When I look at 20th century, a lot of scientific and technological innovation came from the government. I mean, Soviets, obviously, it was the government led, but even in US, you had NASA, you had, certain labs that were very much under the government kind of control, government regulation. But looking at the state of affairs right now, you see a lot of defense, AI innovation, and everything really coming from not just government labs, but from VC-backed private startups, right? How does that shift? And I guess, what does it shift? I mean, for national security and procurement culture?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's funny, if we would have had this conversation even 30 years ago, it wouldn't have been a question, because all major research and development that was happening in the West, and definitely in the United States, was being done by the government, right? Our ability to record this podcast is because of the World Wide Web. And at the end of the day, the web in and of itself is an outcome of a DARPA research project, right? The GPS that you and I use in our cars or in our phones to get from point A to point B, that was a military innovation, right? That had battlefield application, but then had commercial application later, right? So this dual use theme, I think, is one that's important for us to consider. But you're right, though, in saying that kind of there's been a shift as to where that R&D is being done and how is it being funded. A lot of defense experts like to talk about something that happened in the Clinton administration in 1993 called the quote unquote Last Supper. And this is where a meeting where the Secretary of Defense at the time, Les Aspin, gathered the CEOs of 33 major R&D and defense contractor firms and said, look, if we have this, look to the guy to your left, look to the guy to your right, because in 2 or 3 years, only one of you is going to be here, right? So defense spending, and again, this was because the idea that the Cold War was over, globalization and democratization were on the rise. The United States did not face an existential threat like it did the Soviets. Therefore, the money that went into the defense establishment to include R&D did not need to be as big as it had been the previous decades. Of course, we know now where we are right now, and we have to have that. But at the time, that was the decision that was made. And as you rightly put, then that put kind of the locus of R&D funding into the private sector. Now, in some ways, this is good, right? Because it's something that maybe taxpayers' money isn't going to. You have the ability to kind of not have to worry in the private sector of crossing what we call the valley of death of a new technology to where it's procured and actually bought by a government entity or a government contract. But then there's also the challenge at the end of the day, if I'm working in a lab for, let's say, Google or for Ford Motor Company, at the end of the day, I'm probably only going to be looking at existing research that I can make an argument will lead to some type of value creation, right? That's a very, very different incentive proposition than looking at technology that may or may not work out, right? That may not necessarily help raise money or generate revenue. But if it creates a technological breakthrough, then that's an investment that a state will want to have, right? Lockheed Martin had a company based out of California and in Nevada throughout the Cold War called Skunk Works that created all sorts of different ways of planes that could not really fly.
Yeah.
But they had to do that to get to the SR-71 Blackbird to get to stealth technology. So in other words, if that research and development would have only been done in a private sector capacity, after 2 or 3 years, someone would say, look, we're not going to throw any more money towards this. We're accountable to our board. We're accountable to our shareholders. We're not going to throw money at something that's not immediately creating value. So that to me is the potential rub and the challenge. If you look at a country like China or Russia, where you have state-based control of companies and research and development, there's not that public-private divide, right? It's all in one. So that I think is one of the challenges that we have to consider.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And that's actually becoming more and more visible too, is, especially with federal grants and all that for scientific research. Everything is more kind of directed for the purpose of value creation, which might be beneficial in the short run, but in the long run, how it will look, it's obviously the question. I have a few last questions, but you're making so many fascinating points, Professor. I feel like I'm coming up with new questions as you speak. We are in a new era of economic nationalism. The tariffs, the export controls, reshoring. Are these temporary politics or it's the new norm?
No, I think it's definitely the new normal. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. And I don't see it changing anytime soon because of kind of the structural reasons that we've discussed this, in the last hour. Emergent tech, shifting political priorities within countries and between nations, disagreements as to kind of how to deal with transnational problems. We're really kind of getting back to what a mentor of mine calls beggar thy neighbor geopolitics, right? I'm going to do what I'm going to do what's best for me, and maybe it'll be good for you or not, but I don't care, right? Where does that then has trickle down effects, obviously, on the private sector? Are there areas that could have been profitable in the past, but now because of sanctions issues, trade limitations, variations of things coming out of Washington, D.C., I don't know if I can accept that much risk. Do I need to kind of think about things differently? I also think that we're not at all in the place where we can adequately predict what the next 5 to 10 years are going to look like. I'm not a big fan of this idea of present day plus one as a way of trying to articulate what the future is going to be, right? Because we just don't know. And I think there's also the challenge of what does the data and information kind of tell us versus is there some type of underlying reality, which in futures forecasting we call deep signaling, we're not paying attention to, right? On one hand, if you look at the United States economy today, on one hand, you'll get a group that'll point out all the good news stories of, hey, look, we're getting countries to change their behavior with tariffs. The stock market's continuing to grow, blah, 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 blah. But there's other indicators that maybe there are structural weaknesses that we can't see. Or as I said to someone before, the economy was roaring in 2008 after the financial crisis hit. Right. There's other examples of where we see countries that or political actors that we see as inherently stable. And the next thing you know, they're gone. Right? One would have argued a year ago that the Assad regime was firmly entrenched in Syria with strong Russian and Iranian backing, and that the Assad regime and the Alawite community within Syria was going to be the top dog. And you fast forward 2 more months, December of last year, Assad is overthrown, and the map of the Middle East has radically changed because of that. Same with when the Soviet Union imploded, the same with when Eastern Europe threw off the shackles of communism. These were kind of unanticipated things. And then there's the transnational unanticipated things as well, like COVID-19, that we just can't control for. And so I think because of that, government protectionism, more state intervention in the private sector, less hands-off kind of markets, that this is the new normal. And because that's the new normal, it's going to be subjective to shocks, internal and external, that are hard to predict. So in other words, the global economy will be suboptimal. We're not in the 1990s or the early 2000s where things are continuing to grow at record pace. We're probably headed towards a different place right now.
This is very interesting, Professor. One thing, I have one more question, but from what you said, I have a very quick follow-up question. To me, and maybe it's the wrong question, but I still want you to help me out with the answer in a way, because I'm a bit confused. Looking at, I guess, 20th century, you would see this clear ideological divide between Western liberal democracy versus this totalitarian communist regime, right? You, I mean, I don't know whose quote that is, but they're like, oh, there's no good and evil, there's immoral and less immoral, that kind of comparison. But I mean, looking back, you could see this clear divide in a way. To me, it was visible. As you said, countries are becoming more and more very similar in their conduct, in their policies, in their approach to economics, and etc. Is the ideology of today and tomorrow is just pure pursuit of power and dominance?
So this is a good question. In many ways, I think that it actually is a race for economic prosperity. Crazy and counterfactual as that may seem, from the wars that we see on the news, the things that we've discussed, at the end of the day, countries and the companies that exist within those countries, even if they're multinational companies, we are in a time in human history where the aggregation of wealth and capital is seen as a good thing, right? Now, where that wealth is aggregated, right, if it's by a political party or by, like a wealthy, the top 1%, whatever you want to use, but there's that drive, right? President Trump, I would argue, one of the things that incentivizes his engagement in conflicts and crises is, in his mental model, one of the best ways to not only leverage America as the largest market in the world and leverage America's advantages in energy, tech, what have you, is you need to have a world that's largely at peace, right? And once you will have that world that's at peace, now the economic advantages of the United States, and to a lesser degree the West, can play out, right? So there's an economic and business imperative of the peace plan to try to end the war between Hamas and Israel, right? There is an incentive to try to end the war in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, so that, efforts and energy can be shifted in other parts of the world. So I think that there's that driving imperative there. I think the difference of what we would see maybe in the previous administrations or even previous Republican administrations is the way in which you do that is very, very different. One of the things that came out of World War II and the Cold War era was that the sovereignty of a nation was inviolable, and that countries, no matter of what size and scope, should have equal voice. We're not really seeing that right now, right? I've read some call, we've shifted from an era of great power competition to one of great power collusion. So much that while, there's not a huge amount of love lost between, let's say, Trump and Xi Jinping, in Trump's mind, not fighting a war against China is better than fighting a war against China, because wars are economically disruptive. So can you agree enough between kind of the great poles of the world? I will agree with you on this and that. If you agree with me on this and that, you do what you need to do in your part of the world. I'll do what I want to do in my part of the world. And the theory is then things can be productive. The challenge is, if you view the world through near abroads and spheres of influence and autarkic economic models, those are inherently unstable. They incentivize warlike behavior. They create suboptimal economic outcomes, and it drives you back to the things that have made global wars happen for the last 500 years.
Wow. Interesting times we're living, huh? Looking ahead, I feel like every era had its own defining question. This is my final question, Professor. So, really grateful for your time and for your wonderful insights. Every era has its own defining question. For the nuclear age, it was the concept of survival, right? Like, we had to survive that period. And for globalization, it was growth. For the age of AI and autonomy, what do you think humanity's defining question will be, and what kind of wisdom will it demand from us?
No, I think this is a great question. And I think what I'll do is I'll just kind of revert back to some of these earlier themes we've discussed, which is, can our concepts, our laws, our governing mechanisms, our institutions keep pace with emergent tech? And that, to me, is kind of the ultimate question that's out there. And as you said just a few minutes ago, there's no experts on certain fields because the fields are continually evolving, right? So that, to me, is going to be kind of the greatest question. And I'll also cheat a little bit and follow up and say that we're still dealing with, and we still very much are in a world of survival in a nuclear era. Those nuclear weapons are still there. They're not to the great volume that they were at the peak of the Cold War in the 1970s, but you still have nuclear weapons capabilities, right? So we still have to think about nuclear and strategic deterrence. The incentivization for economic growth is, again, it's still there, right? No country will ever say, I'm happy with the size of our GDP today and our levels of employment and the balance of trade. Never going to say that. So it's this confluence of all these things happening at the time of multiple strategic shocks, something that I've called compound security in the past with a colleague of mine. Others call it the poly crisis. All these things are happening at once. And these trends are outpacing existing laws, existing alliances, existing international and national legal regimes. And it's leading us to kind of this chaotic environment that, in my estimation, is not the most stable.
Oh, well. I'm only hoping that it's gonna get somehow better eventually. Thank you so much, Professor Smitson. It's always a pleasure talking to you, whether it's on podcast or just our personal calls. But thank you so much for joining me on Startup Strides. This was a fascinating deep dive, and it's been an honor exploring it with you today.
Well, thank you, Javed. It was great to be with you, and thanks to all the listeners that are out there. We'll have to do it again sometime.
100%.